As mentioned in the introduction to this course, the legal availability and use of federal appropriations is based on three core elements: purpose, time, and amount. In this module, we will discuss these elements and their application in more detail. The concept of availability is grounded in three basic elements: purpose, time, and amount. When an agency is deciding whether to obligate money for a specific activity or project, it must determine whether its funds are or are not available for the obligation and outlay. The answer to this question depends on the following three rules. First, the purpose for which an obligation or outlay is made must be authorized by the Congress. Second, the obligation must occur within the time limit specified in the appropriation. And third, the obligation and outlay must be within the amount established by the Congress. All of these must be observed for an obligation and outlay to be legal. While this seems simple enough, you will find that sometimes the application of these rules can be complex and confusing. Fortunately, to help with situations that are unclear, there is a large body of rulings on real-world cases. GAO's Principles of Federal Appropriations Law, called the Red Book, is a major source of guidance, along with legal rulings from the federal courts and the Department of Justice. Now, let's explore the three elements of availability in detail, beginning with the element of purpose. As discussed in earlier modules, the Constitution gives only Congress the power to appropriate funds for use by the federal agencies. These appropriations must be derived from an act of Congress. This is usually an annual appropriation act, but in some cases, appropriations can be made through an authorization act or other substantive legislation. One of the basic statutes dealing with the use of appropriations is Section 1301A of Title 31 of the United States Code, called the Purpose Statute. This statute states, "Appropriations shall be applied only to the objects for which the appropriations were made, except as otherwise provided by law." Most experts agree that this law further clarifies the authority already embodied in the Appropriations Clause of the Constitution. In its simplest terms, the Purpose Statute says that public funds may only be used for the purposes for which they were appropriated. Now, let's discuss how agencies can determine the authorized purposes of their appropriations. It should be clear by now that determining the purposes that are authorized or allowed by a particular appropriation is essential to the proper use of federal funds. But making this determination is not always easy or clear. Sometimes questions are raised about whether particular items or activities can be covered within a given appropriation. It is in this area that most appropriations law questions arise. So, how does an agency determine the authorized purposes of its appropriation and answer such questions? First and foremost, analyze the Appropriation Act itself and follow the plain meaning of the language. This means the common meaning of the language used. You should also consult the legislative history of the Appropriations Act in the following order of importance: Conference Committee Report, House and Senate Committee Reports, floor debates printed in the Congressional Record, and committee hearing transcripts. If the language in the appropriation is broad and general in nature, an agency should consult the legislation that authorizes the appropriation and its underlying organic legislation. While the Purpose Statute is very strict, it is applied with some reason and flexibility. It does not require that every object or expense of an agency be specifically mentioned in the Appropriations Act. According to GAO, an agency has reasonable discretion in determining what its appropriated funds can be used for. This concept is known as the necessary expense doctrine. According to this doctrine, a legitimate expense, that is, an obligation or outlay, must be necessary or contribute materially to the purposes of the appropriation, and connected logically to the appropriation or an agency's functions and activities. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency wanted to purchase buttons promoting indoor air quality for an environmental conference it was holding. GAO found that this expenditure was valid because the message conveyed by the buttons was related and contributed to the EPA's mission. Not prohibited by other law. A past example was when the military wanted to obligate funds for the installation and maintenance of water pipelines at one of its military-based golf courses. GAO ruled that this expenditure was not permissible because another law was in force that prohibited the use of appropriated funds to equip, operate, and maintain golf courses. As noted earlier, an agency has reasonable discretion in determining what its appropriated funds can be used for. This concept is known as the necessary expense doctrine. According to this doctrine, a legitimate expense, that is, an obligation or outlay, must be necessary or contribute materially to the purposes of the appropriation, and connected logically to the appropriation or an agency's functions and activities. Not prohibited by other law. Not otherwise provided for, such as in another appropriation or other legislation. This relates to the classification of specific versus general appropriations. Simply put, if the Congress enacts an appropriation for a specific purpose, and the agency has another, more general appropriation that could be used for the same purpose, the agency cannot use the general appropriation for activities that are funded by the specific appropriation. This is true even if the general appropriation has remaining funds and the specific appropriation does not. For example, Federal Prison Industries, a government corporation affiliated with the Bureau of Prisons, planned to build a prison factory and associated residential camp next to a federal prison. GAO found that it could use its funds for this purpose, but could not use its funds to build other prisons, because such construction was already provided for in another BOP appropriations account. Also, the residential camp was deemed part of the operation of the factory. Likewise, the Navy was not allowed to use appropriations made for the construction or procurement of vessels and aircraft to provide housing for civilian employees engaged in defense production activities, because funds for that purpose were otherwise available. Just remember, these are the criteria that must be met when deciding on whether a particular item or activity can be funded. And all these criteria must be met. Justifications like it saves money or other offices do it just won't cut it. Now let's discuss the next limitation on the use of federal funds: time. This section will explore the limitations on the use of appropriations relating to the element of time, that is, when such funds may be obligated and expended. The rules flow from the Congress's power of the purse. Simply, the basic rule concerning time is that an obligation must occur within the time limits applicable to the appropriation. Placing time limits on the availability of appropriations is one of the means of congressional control over funding. In this way, the Congress can reserve to itself the right to review a particular program or an agency's activities. To better understand availability as it relates to the element of time, we need to quickly review the types of appropriations Congress makes and the lifespan of appropriated funds. As discussed in detail in Module 2, funds are appropriated and made available for obligation for either 1 year, annual funds, multi-year, more than 1 year, or no year, no limit, available until expended. Consequently, if an agency is operating under an annual appropriation, it must charge its obligations within that 1 year, and if operating under a 2-year appropriation, obligations must occur within those 2 years. However, if an agency is operating a program under a no-year appropriation, there is no time limit on the obligations. Instead, the agency can obligate the funds until such time as they are all expended, that is, used up. Any funds that are not obligated by the end of the time period specified in the appropriation will expire. That is, the funds will cease to be available for incurring new obligations. An agency's operating or salaries and expenses account is a good example of annual funding. Many grant programs use multi-year funding. Agency construction programs are often funded with no-year appropriations because of the length of time needed to complete such building projects. However, some construction programs are funded by multi-year appropriations. The bona fide needs rule is one of the basic principles of appropriations law. It states that a legal obligation or expense can be charged to a fiscal year appropriation only to meet a legitimate or bona fide need arising in the fiscal year for which the appropriation was made. In some cases, the rule includes needs identified in the prior year and continuing in the year of the appropriation to be charged. More simply, the obligation must be for an agency requirement that is needed or continues to be needed in the fiscal year to which the obligation will be charged. The application of the bona fide needs rule and time limits can be complicated for budget managers in the real world of executing their budget plans. Here are some hypothetical examples of what we mean. The first concerns ordering goods. An agency ordered some computer equipment and obligated funds in April 2009. The vendor delayed delivery several times and finally declared in early November 2009, which is fiscal year 2010, that he could not fill the order. Could the agency place a new order for the same or similar equipment in November using FY 2009 funds on the new order? The answer is yes, since the bona fide need occurred in fiscal year 2009 and continues in fiscal year 2010. An agency issued a purchase order in fiscal year 2009 to procure goods. Delivery of the goods was delayed, and the agency decided that the items were not needed anymore. The vendor was notified to cancel the order. Because of the vendor's poor communication, the vendor shipped the order anyway in October 2009. The agency decided to keep the parts despite the earlier cancellation. Could the agency obligate and charge the purchase to fiscal year 2009 funds, since that was the year the original order was made? The answer is no, because the bona fide need rule was canceled when the order was canceled. The parts must be paid for now with fiscal year 2010 funds. In obligating funds for services, the application of the bona fide needs rule becomes a bit more complicated. We must first consider whether the service is non-severable, that is, whether the service is a single undertaking that cannot be divided, like a research contract with an end result, or severable, that is, if you stop the service, like a contract to clean windows, you still have something to show for the obligation. Non-severable services may take more than one fiscal year to complete, as long as the bona fide need was met in the fiscal year you obligated the funds. Severable services must normally cover the period of availability of the funding appropriation, generally 1 year, in order to meet the requirements of the bona fide needs rule. Congress permitted an exception to the bona fide needs rule in the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994, allowing obligations for severable services in annual accounts to span 2 fiscal years, as long as the period covered by the obligation does not exceed 1 year. That means you may obligate funds on September 30th of 1 year to last until September 29th of the next year. If the bona fide need for these services continues into the next year, an obligation may be made from that year's appropriation to extend the service for another year. Here are some hypothetical examples of applying the bona fides needs test to ordering services. An agency obligated funds in June 2010 for a 3-year contract for a research project. These funds came from an appropriation that was available only for 1 year. Does this obligation meet the bona fide needs rule? The answer is yes, because the agency had a bona fide need in fiscal year 2010 for a research project that takes 3 years to complete, and they used currently available appropriations to fully fund the contract. Because this is a non-severable service, it meets the bona fide need test. Due to a lack of funding, an agency obligated annual funds in June 2010 for only the first year of a 3-year contract for a non-severable research project, planning to add the additional funds from subsequent years' appropriations. Does this obligation meet the bona fide needs rule? The answer is no, because the agency had a bona fide need in fiscal year 2010 for a research project that takes 3 years to complete, and because it is non-severable, it has to be fully funded in the year in which there is a bona fide need. An agency obligated annual funds in August 2010 for a severable contract for security services that would last until August 2011. In September, they discovered they had additional funds, so they extended the security services contract until August 2012. Does this obligation meet the bona fide needs rule? The answer is no, because a security contract is a severable service, and an agency's bona fide need could not exceed the availability of its 1-year appropriation. As you can see, applying the bona fide needs test is a very tricky area of appropriations law. If there's any doubt about whether the bona fide needs test is being met, you should consult your general counsel's office. As we learned in Module 2, appropriations have a lifespan and go through several phases. These are the current or unexpired phase, the expired phase, and the closed or canceled phase. The lifespan of appropriations depends on whether the funds are annual, multi-year, or no year. For example, an annual or 1-year appropriation is available for the current year and 5 expired years, after which the funds are canceled and the account is closed. Similarly, a 2-year or multi-year appropriation is available for 2 current years and 5 expired years and then canceled. Finally, no-year appropriations are current every year until the funds are expended. These lifespan distinctions are important to keep in mind when deciding where to charge obligations in relation to the bona fide needs rule. You should remember that this rule applies to both annual appropriations and multi-year appropriations. An agency may use a multi-year appropriation for needs arising at any time during the multi-year period of availability. On the other hand, the rule does not apply to no-year funds, since they have no time limit. Here are some illustrative cases. An agency had some appropriation balances for salaries remaining unobligated at the end of one fiscal year. It could not use the balances to pay for salaries for services provided in the following fiscal year because the time period of availability of the funding balance had passed. At the end of the fiscal year, an agency discovered that it had some excess public housing subsidy funds. It was not allowed to send the excess funds to its state agency to offset subsidies in the following year, since this amounted to obligating the funds for needs in a subsequent year. Thus far in this module, we have covered the purposes that funds can be used for and the time limits within which funds must be obligated and expended. Now we will turn to the third and final element of availability of appropriations, limitations related to amount. The Constitution gives only the Congress authority to make laws and provide the money to carry them out. Thus, the Congress has the last word on how money can be spent by an agency. While the Congress gives an agency reasonable discretion in using its appropriated funds, the amount is ultimately the Congress's call. Simply put, an agency cannot spend more than Congress gives it. This is where the Anti-Deficiency Act that we discussed in an earlier module and other financial laws come into play. The Anti-Deficiency Act's limitations ensure that an agency does not obligate and expend amounts in excess of those provided in the appropriations or other laws. Its purpose is to prevent an agency from becoming deficient, that is, from running out of money. The Adequacy of Appropriations Act supplements the Anti-Deficiency Act by requiring that any obligation you make have an adequate amount of appropriations to finance it. It is also important to note that there are exceptions to the prohibitions in the Anti-Deficiency Act, which allow for emergencies which preserve human life and property. You should always keep in mind that the Anti-Deficiency Act applies to both current and expired appropriations. The seriousness of the amount limitation is underscored by the fact that the Anti-Deficiency Act is the only funding statute that includes both civil and criminal penalties for violation. These include administrative discipline, suspension without pay, removal from office, fine of no more than $5,000, and imprisonment for up to 2 years. The major Anti-Deficiency Act violations are obligating more than your appropriations, obligating in advance of receiving your appropriation, obligating more than your apportionment, obligating more than your agency regulations permit, some agencies use the term allotment, and accepting unauthorized voluntary services. Obligating in excess of an apportionment or allotment is the most frequent type of violation. So just remember, keep a close eye on your spending in relation to the amounts in the appropriation, the apportionment from OMB, and your agency's operating plan, and other controls. Another rule related to appropriated amounts is the limitation on the augmentation of appropriated funds. This limitation is not stipulated in a single law, but is derived from several separate statutes. It states that an agency may not augment, that is, add to, its appropriation from outside sources without specific statutory authority. When Congress passes an appropriation, it is also setting a program level for the agency or program. It is saying that an agency cannot operate above the level financed by its appropriation. To allow an agency to accept funds from other sources and operate at a higher level would effectively undercut the Congress's power of the purse. There are numerous instances where the augmentation concept comes into play. For instance, an agency cannot accept cash contributions from other governments, non-governmental organizations, or the public to help carry out its programs and activities without specific legislative authority. Also, an agency cannot transfer some of its appropriated funds to another agency to support some worthwhile project. Both of these would constitute augmentation unless Congress passed legislation authorizing the cash gift or the transfer. Here's a real-life example of the rule. The staff of an agency's office in a small town provided assistance to the local community in responding to a severe flood. As a sign of appreciation, the town council delivered a check for $5,000 to improve the office's public reception room. The reception room is in real need of renovation, and the work has been scheduled. Could the agency office accept these funds? The answer is no, since this would be augmenting the agency's appropriations. Only appropriated funds could be used for the office's renovation. Finally, there is a distinction made between cash and in-kind services. The augmentation rule relates to the receipt of money. The receipt of in-kind services is dealt with under separate legislation on limiting the acceptance of voluntary services. Now let's review what we've learned. In this module, we've discussed the concept of availability of federal appropriations. The main points to remember are shown here. To properly use appropriations, you must work within the limitations of the purpose, time, and amount of the specific appropriations account. These elements, or limits, need to be applied on a case-by-case basis. If you're uncertain about the availability or the use of funds, or the language is unclear, you should seek the advice of the General Counsel in your agency, from OMB, and informally from GAO, if necessary. Remember, in these instances, 2 or more heads are better than 1.